Our resources are greater than they were 2 months ago by a considerable margin, and the pace of prosecutions and fraud will increase at a considerable margin, and you'll see that roll out over the coming weeks and months.
Minneapolis was still asleep when the operation began. Before sunrise, armored federal vehicles rolled into position across multiple neighborhoods. Engines idled briefly, then went silent. No sirens, no public warning. Within minutes, coordinated entry teams from ICE and DHS moved simultaneously on residential properties, commercial addresses, and warehouse sites tied to an ongoing investigation that had been building quietly for months. This was not a spontaneous action. It was the execution phase of a long-term intelligence effort. Digital surveillance, financial tracking, property records, communications analysis. Every movement that morning followed a mapped timeline. Doors were breached with controlled force. Evidence teams followed immediately behind entry units. Laptops, phones, storage devices, financial documents, and cargo inventories were secured before information could be destroyed. The objective was clear: disrupt a network believed to be operating beneath the visible surface of the city. Officials later confirmed the targets were connected through overlapping financial channels and logistical pathways. What appeared outwardly as independent businesses were, according to investigators, nodes in a wider structure. Then the situation shifted. At 9:37 a.m. on Portland Avenue South, during an active enforcement action, a federal officer discharged his weapon, fatally striking 37-year-old Renee Nicole Good. She had reportedly just returned home after dropping her child at school. According to verified reports, 3 shots were fired as her vehicle moved away from the scene. Video of the moment circulated rapidly online. Within hours, Minneapolis became the center of national attention. Protests formed quickly. Crowds gathered demanding transparency and accountability. Local schools paused operations. Emergency response units repositioned across key districts. The atmosphere changed from controlled enforcement to volatile uncertainty. At the same time, Operation Metro Surge, a federal initiative involving ICE and DHS, was already underway across Minnesota. Thousands of agents had been deployed to assist with enforcement priorities tied to broader investigations. The visible scale of the presence, armored units, marked vehicles, coordinated arrests, intensified public tension in several neighborhoods. As unrest grew, parallel narratives began to surface. Local media reports and community sources pointed toward allegations involving Judge Hassan Dwell, a prominent figure within the Minneapolis Somali community. According to circulating claims, his courtroom influence may have intersected with individuals under federal scrutiny. At this stage, not all allegations were confirmed. However, investigative threads suggested something larger than a single incident. Sources referenced structured movement of people and goods through concealed routes and layered financial channels. If accurate, this would indicate an organized system capable of generating substantial revenue while avoiding traditional detection methods. The shooting had ignited public unrest, but behind the scenes, federal teams were still working through data, and new signals began to emerge. As protests filled the streets, local authorities started receiving reports of missing individuals. Families contacted police about loved ones who had not returned home following enforcement activity in their neighborhoods. Initially, these were treated as isolated concerns, but patterns began to form. Several reports clustered geographically. Some timelines overlapped with federal movement blocks earlier that week. That correlation triggered a deeper review. ICE and DHS units, originally focused on stabilization and evidence processing, shifted part of their attention to cross-check disappearance reports against ongoing operations. Investigators began analyzing arrest logs, transport manifests, holding facility transfers, and electronic tracking data. These were not assumptions. They were verification steps. What emerged was not yet a conclusion, but it was enough to expand the scope of the inquiry. Minneapolis was no longer dealing with a single flashpoint. It was confronting the possibility that a hidden logistical structure had been operating inside the city, and that the enforcement surge had only exposed the first visible layer. And the deeper federal teams looked, the more complex the network appeared. What initially appeared to be isolated unrest began to reveal structural anomalies. Multiple missing person reports surfaced in the same districts where enforcement activity had been most concentrated. Community representatives documented cases involving both adults and minors who could not be reached after federal operations moved through their neighborhoods. An official consolidated number was never publicly released. However, police dispatch logs reflected a measurable spike in urgent welfare checks and missing person inquiries within a compressed time window. The clustering alone was enough to trigger analytical review. The first significant breakthrough did not come from the streets. It came from data. Task force analysts reviewing telecommunications metadata and municipal transportation logs identified irregular movement patterns during peak unrest hours. These were not routine traffic fluctuations. Vehicle flows and mobile device signals showed synchronized departures from specific blocks that did not align with public transit schedules or standard commuter behavior. Authorities have not publicly detailed these findings, but sources familiar with the review indicated that some of the movement patterns suggested coordinated relocation, activity that blended into the larger disruption and therefore avoided immediate scrutiny. What made the discovery more complex was geographic expansion. Similar signal patterns appeared along outbound transit corridors connecting Minneapolis to adjacent regions. The timing suggested that whoever was moving people or assets was exploiting the instability created by protests and enforcement surges. Simultaneously, residents reported observing unmarked vans positioned near active federal zones. Vehicles would idle briefly, stop and leave before identification could be captured. While anecdotal, these observations aligned with the anomalous mobility data under review. Journalists and independent researchers began compiling these accounts. Some reports were later clarified or disproven, others remained unresolved. But the aggregate picture suggested that the public unrest may have overlapped with parallel activity operating under its cover. Federal investigators widened their scope. Witness interviews revealed accounts of individuals being detained or transported under circumstances that did not always align cleanly with publicly released arrest summaries. Discrepancies between witness timelines and official documentation prompted internal cross-verification. According to internal communications later referenced by media outlets, certain investigative teams began exploring the possibility that the week's unrest had unintentionally created operational concealment for unrelated activity that may have predated the protests entirely. At that point, Minneapolis was no longer simply a city responding to civil tension. It had become an active investigative node. Then, attention shifted toward influence networks. Community sources and local reporting referenced Judge Hassan Dwell, a respected Somali-American member of the Minneapolis judicial system. At first, these references were speculative, but as the broader inquiry expanded into financial channels and case routing patterns, analysts reportedly began reviewing historical case outcomes and courtroom assignments connected to individuals under scrutiny. It is critical to note, no formal public indictment confirmed wrongdoing at that stage. However, investigative interest alone was enough to intensify scrutiny. Unverified claims circulated suggesting that judicial discretion may have intersected with organized illicit operations, ranging from protective case handling to shielding individuals connected to forced labor and narcotics distribution channels. These claims remained allegations, not established findings. But in an environment already destabilized by federal enforcement and public distrust, the perception of institutional overlap carried weight. Residents began questioning not only street-level activity, but the structural integrity of oversight systems within the city. And as federal analysts continued mapping financial transactions, communication clusters, and mobility corridors, one possibility grew harder to ignore. The visible chaos in Minneapolis may have been only the surface layer of a much deeper operational architecture. The rumors surrounding Judge Hassan Dwell intensified as the broader investigation expanded. Within community circles, speculation suggested that his legal authority and courtroom access may have intersected with individuals connected to cross-border narcotics and human movement networks. These claims remained unproven. No formal charges had established such involvement at that stage. But the persistence of the allegations forced scrutiny. Investigators began separating narrative from verifiable data. Analytical teams reportedly reviewed historical case assignments, bond decisions, sealed filings, and procedural anomalies connected to individuals already under federal review. Former staff members, local sources, and peripheral witnesses referenced irregular administrative patterns, unexplained shipments, atypical financial flows, and case outcomes that did not align with standard prosecutorial trajectories. None of these signals alone constituted proof, but together they justified deeper examination. The volatility of the moment amplified everything. Public anger following the shooting of Renee Nicole Good had created an environment where distrust spread rapidly. As enforcement intensified and neighborhoods saw visible federal presence, speculation about institutional shielding gained traction. In high-stress environments, correlation is often mistaken for causation. Federal agents initially categorized the allegations as rumor-driven escalation. However, the volume of claims and overlapping investigative threads eventually required formal review. The question was no longer whether the rumors were politically charged, it was whether any underlying structural overlap existed between judicial processes and active criminal targets. At that stage, the answer remained unresolved, but the investigation itself was evolving beyond local boundaries. As morning briefings were delivered and operational summaries compiled, federal authorities clarified that the Minneapolis surge was not solely about unrest management. According to statements from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the operation targeted individuals with serious prior convictions, including homicide, aggravated assault, and controlled substance distribution. Officials described the effort as part of a broader strategy aimed at disrupting violent and narcotics-linked networks operating within Minnesota. And that distinction matters. When DHS references removal of high-risk offenders, it signals engagement with larger distribution architectures. Modern illicit supply chains rarely operate as isolated street-level entities. They function as layered systems: sourcing, transport, staging, financial laundering, and retail distribution. Minneapolis, while geographically distant from coastal ports, is deeply embedded in national logistics infrastructure. The city connects directly to interstate highway corridors, Class 1 rail systems, regional air cargo routes, and commercial freight pipelines that link to major maritime gateways. Containers entering through hubs such as the Port of Los Angeles or transiting near the Panama Canal can be remanifested, redirected, or subdivided multiple times before reaching inland destinations. Transportation analysts have long warned that contraband rarely travels in obvious form. Goods are repackaged, documentation is layered, ownership chains are fragmented across shell entities. By the time cargo reaches inland consolidation points, it can appear indistinguishable from legitimate freight. In that context, an inland city becomes more than a destination. It becomes a redistribution node. Federal briefings following Operation Metro Surge indicated that enforcement actions were not confined to one crime category. Arrest targets included individuals tied to narcotics distribution, violent offenses, and organized cross-state coordination. That multidimensional approach reflects a recognition that modern criminal ecosystems do not separate neatly into compartments. Drug distribution networks often overlap with transportation fraud, document manipulation, financial layering, and in some cases, exploitation rings. A local arrest can reveal upstream suppliers and downstream financial conduits spanning multiple states. During press statements, DHS representatives emphasized that the Minneapolis arrests formed part of a wider disruption strategy, one designed to interrupt logistical continuity rather than simply remove isolated offenders. That framing suggests something critical. Authorities were not just reacting to unrest, they were tracing infrastructure. And as analysts continued mapping transit anomalies, financial irregularities, and institutional intersections, a more complex picture emerged, one where visible street-level chaos may have obscured deeper movement across rail lines, highways, and digital ledgers. The central question was no longer about a single individual. It was about whether Minneapolis had been functioning, knowingly or unknowingly, as a midstream junction inside a larger international distribution architecture. And if so, how long it had operated before anyone connected the dots. As enforcement activity expanded, residents and local officials began noticing a broader pattern. Entire neighborhoods, residential blocks, small businesses, even public spaces became part of coordinated federal sweeps. What initially appeared as targeted arrests began to look more systemic. The question shifted from who was being detained to what structure had required this level of synchronized intervention. Law enforcement did not publicly confirm the existence of a single centralized global network anchored in Minneapolis. That distinction is important. However, officials were clear about something else. The individuals arrested were connected to patterns long tracked across multiple states: drug distribution, violent offenses, and organized coordination that adapts as enforcement tightens in one region and shifts elsewhere. This was not described as a one-city anomaly. It was framed as part of a broader operational ecosystem. As analysts evaluated the Minneapolis intervention, they examined why specific logistical patterns had converged there at that moment. Minneapolis sits inland, but it is deeply integrated into national rail, highway, and freight systems. Distribution hubs do not require ocean access. They require connectivity, and Minneapolis has that connectivity. Federal agencies made no claim of dismantling a global enterprise overnight, but the intervention underscored a reality often acknowledged quietly within enforcement circles. Illicit distribution systems rarely exist in isolation. They embed themselves inside legitimate transit flows and adapt continuously. Then the narrative environment shifted. Amid visible enforcement, rumors began circulating about underground infrastructure, hidden passages, concealed rooms, and extensive tunnel systems allegedly discovered during raids near properties connected to individuals under scrutiny. These claims did not originate from official briefings or court filings. They spread through live streams, social media threads, and word-of-mouth accounts during an already volatile period. According to these unverified narratives, federal agents had uncovered subterranean corridors beneath residential blocks, rough passageways allegedly used for concealed storage and movement. Some versions described crates, equipment, and vehicles removing cargo not reflected in public inventories. More dramatic, accounts claimed large numbers of individuals had been located underground and brought to safety. Others referenced substantial quantities of currency and contraband allegedly extracted from concealed chambers. These accounts expanded rapidly. Figures escalated. Tons of material, millions in cash, hundreds of people. Each retelling amplified scale and urgency. But there is a critical line here. No major news organization confirmed the existence of extensive tunnel networks. No federal agency issued a press release documenting the discovery of underground vaults or mass recoveries from hidden chambers. There were no publicly filed indictments referencing subterranean infrastructure of that scale. In high-tension environments, information ecosystems can accelerate beyond verified evidence. Investigators are trained to separate operational fact from rumor propagation. During the Minneapolis surge, federal briefings remained focused on documented arrests, criminal histories, and logistics-based disruption strategies, not underground labyrinths. That does not mean every claim was fabricated. It means none were formally substantiated. And that distinction matters, because in moments of civic strain, speculation can fill informational gaps faster than verified reporting. As Minneapolis processed enforcement, unrest, and overlapping investigations, the city found itself balancing two realities at once: the confirmed arrests tied to violent and narcotics-related offenses, and the unconfirmed narratives of hidden infrastructure operating beneath the visible city. For federal investigators, the objective remained consistent: follow data, document evidence, and build cases capable of withstanding judicial scrutiny. For the public, however, the uncertainty created space for something else: a lingering question. If the visible operation was only one layer of the story, what structural elements had allowed these networks, confirmed or alleged, to operate as long as they did? No photographs of tunnels were released. No official inventories documented underground vaults or hidden passageways. What was formally recorded were standard law enforcement procedures: arrests executed under warrant authority, property searches tied to criminal investigations, and evidence removal connected to specific charges. Public briefings from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security emphasized arrests of individuals with serious and violent criminal records, including assault, narcotics distribution, and repeat felony offenses. There was no reference to subterranean networks or mass discoveries beneath the city. Yet the tunnel narratives persisted. For many residents living through weeks of enforcement, unrest, and uncertainty, the rumors provided a framework, a way to process disruption that felt larger than any single explanation. In moments of instability, the human mind searches for structure. Stories can move faster than documentation. The idea of hidden infrastructure beneath familiar streets offered a dramatic answer to a confusing reality, even without verification. But the documented record remains clear. Operation Metro Surge, led by ICE and the Department of Homeland Security, was described by federal authorities as a targeted enforcement initiative focused on individuals with established criminal histories. Officials framed the intervention as part of a broader national effort to disrupt violent and narcotics-linked networks operating across state lines. At the same time, the scale of the federal presence sparked legal and civic challenges. Minnesota officials, including state and municipal representatives, filed federal suits questioning aspects of the deployment. Civil liberties organizations raised concerns about enforcement scope and procedural safeguards. These developments reflect a familiar tension within complex operations: security objectives operating alongside constitutional boundaries and public scrutiny. From a federal enforcement perspective, Minneapolis represented a high-intensity convergence of intelligence coordination, logistical disruption, and multi-agency execution. From a civic perspective, it exposed how rapidly trust, fear, rumor, and verified action can collide in the same space. The visible arrests were documented. The logistical networks remain under investigation. The rumors were never formally substantiated. And the broader questions are about infrastructure, adaptation, and the balance between enforcement and civil oversight remain part of a larger national conversation. As the months of tension began to settle, one reality stood out. Modern criminal systems do not operate in isolation. They intersect with transportation grids, financial channels, and local communities. Disrupting them requires scale. Understanding them requires clarity. And separating fact from speculation requires patience. So now the question shifts to you. Was Minneapolis a contained enforcement surge, or a signal of something structurally larger unfolding beneath the surface of American logistics and law? If you value deep, structured breakdowns of complex federal operations without noise or speculation, subscribe to State Tone, support the channel with a like, share this video, and leave your analysis in the comments. Your perspective shapes the next investigation.